late imperial Russia saw a new wave of interest in idealism. This coincided with a general anti-positivist reorientation of European thought in general of the late 19th century, as described in a classic account by Stuart Hughes, Consciousness and Society, which came out more than half a century ago. In Russia, this has become known as the movement from Marxism to idealism, which in some cases, and probably in the most famous cases in retrospect, and I'm speaking now of the canonized philosophers, involved also a further turn to Christianity, where it meant also a turn to Christianity. It became eventually a religious renaissance, to evoke Nicholas Zionov's term, or what might be his term. He invented it. Yeah. I thought so. Thus, late imperial Russia saw several idealist philosophical projects that at the same time were religiously framed. Idealism was by many understood also as Christian philosophy, or at least as resonating with Christianity and with Orthodoxy. It should be stressed, as for instance Nikolai Plotnikov has done, and Randall also touched upon this in his lecture 2 days ago, that idealism was not necessarily just a stage on a teleological road to a philosophical religious worldview, though it may in retrospect have been the case for some of the most canonized names of the Russian religious Renaissance, and I will return to them in a while. But idealism involved also several trajectories, just to point out that. But first, what is or what was idealism? In Russia, too, it was a reaction against positivism and materialism. For instance, for Sergei Bulgakov, this was first and foremost what idealism meant. It involved also philosophy itself, so idealism was a defense for the autonomy of philosophy. But most basically, and if you now go back to early 19th century idealism in Europe, idealism means that the world or reality is the creation of the mind or of consciousness. The world is the concrete actualization of concepts whose proper home is the mind. This is a common idealist assumption that the Russian thinkers of the late 19th century took over from Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, and even Kant in an idealist understanding of Kant. And I'll return to that shortly, an example of that shortly. All the criticism of Hegel and preference for Schelling notwithstanding, the most basic assumptions of Russian thinkers discussed here were commonly idealist. And this brought them ultimately together with German idealism in toto, not in opposition to it. A thinker who explicitly philosophized on the meaning of idealism in late imperial Russia was Sergei Trubetskoy, Yevgeny's brother, and a younger friend of Solovyov. He was, together with Nikolai Groth and Lev Lopatin were the key members of Moscow Psychological Society. And Sergei Trubetskoy, in 2 articles in the Society's journal, Questions of Philosophy and Psychology, and the title of these articles were, in English, On the Nature of Human Consciousness, published from 1889 to 1891, and then later, The Foundations of Idealism, 1896. Here, Sergei Trubetskoy outlined an idealist conception of philosophy, according to which nothing can be said to exist outside consciousness. The first article proposed a collectivist understanding of consciousness as the most appropriate, and he went far in grounding this idealism in language as the commonly shared medium of our consciousness. In the second article, he didn't talk so much about language and may have abandoned the very explicit collectivism as a foundation for idealism, but yet he emphasized that consciousness is not to be understood in an individual subjective way. As individual subjective consciousness, my brain, he says, is not that. Consciousness for Trubetskoy was something common and universal. So above all, idealism as understood by Trubetskoy implies that the relationship of subject and object is something that exists for consciousness. And I quote in my own translation into English, "The world of phenomena, as it appears to us, is above all a fact of consciousness. We do not know any reality outside of consciousness," unquote. And all phenomena as real objects are subject to the law of consciousness. Trubetskoy developed his argument in dialogue with Kant rather than with subsequent German idealists. Trubetskoy argued that Kant categories of time and space, for instance, were universal categories of the world, not only of our individual minds. Likewise, he went on, we have to assume, that was that causality is a general logic condition of reality. So idealism for Trubetskoy does not mean to proclaim the subjectivity of the logical nature of reality. It is objective and universal, and yet ideal of consciousness. And these were the conclusions that Kant did not draw, Sergei Trubetskoy added. We have, in other words, to have faith in the objective existence of reality as such, and in its inherent features such as time, space, and causality. And in addition to assumption, Trubetskoy also evokes the notion of faith as a precondition for this world outlook. We have to have confident faith in the reality of the world. We have to have faith in outer reality. Although this faith cannot be proven empirically in full, the world of external objects or phenomena would be mere personal illusions without such faith. So we have here an idea of faith as an epistemological foundation. And it was not only Trubetskoy who spoke about faith in this way. Vladimir Solovyov had already done something similar. We encounter this notion of faith in an epistemological sense towards the end of his magnum opus, the work Critique of Abstract Principles, where he called this faith, Viera, as faith in a narrow sense of the word, faith in that which is or exists. So this is just to outline the common idealist context of Yevgeny Trubetskoy, and we shall also see now how it was combined with Christian ideas, religious ideas, this idealism. And Solovyov will remain the example further on. While Solovyov was working on his thesis, Critique of Abstract Principles, he also began to deliver his famous lectures on divine humanity, Чтение Бога человечества, from 1877 on. And the first lecture starts off by defining religion, and this is in keeping with the etymology of the word, as, quote, the connection of humanity and the world with the absolute principle and focus of all that exists, unquote. And this absolute principle is also equated with the divine principle in Solovyov's own terms. At the same time, this connection is not merely given, it is just as much presented as a task. Solovyov's lectures bring up several issues, but they also tell the story of how humanity in the past has responded to the absolute or divine principle in various ways, be it in world religions, Buddhism, Judaism, and of course Christianity, or be it the discovery of ideas in ancient Greece, as historical examples of this connection. At the same time, this is a process that is not completed. The remaining tasks are a further integration of humanity as such, and also humanity with a divine principle. And the culmination would be, as he outlines towards the end of the work, a new universal Christian culture. So it's cultural work, but it's also work of the mind. Central to Solovyov's philosophy at this moment, both in the lecture and also in the philosophical principles of integral knowledge, was the human faculty of intellectual contemplation, umstvenное созерцание in Russian, a notion that was taken from Schelling, intellektuelle Anschau. So it's philosophical speculation which draws on experience, but it's definitely not limited to sense data. And for Solovyov, then this idealism became a philosophical framework for reinterpreting, for instance, the Orthodox anthropological idea of deification as an ethical project and also as more broadly as a culture connected with it, as the means for attaining divine likeness. This idealist grounding of religion, several religions, but ultimately, of course, Christianity, as a worldview prompting humanity to positive work, was taken over by Sergei Bulgakov in his philosophy of economy or philosophy of household, Хозяйство of 1912. The primordial principle for Bulgakov was life. In life, there is an identity between human beings and nature, between subject and object, a perspective that makes labor or everyday strivings meaningful. Bulgakov furthermore posits an identity also between this philosophy of identity, which is fundamentally Schellingian, and Christianity. Both are different kinds of philosophies of identity. And both are also philosophies of incarnated spirit. So Schelling, Christianity, and also in addition these various mythologies of divine wisdoms, and I won't go into them now, but they offer complementary perspectives on humanity in the world. So that is Bulgakov. We may also add Nikolai Berdyaev to this list. His work, Meaning of Creativity. True, the Meaning of Creativity of 1916 opens by describing a much more negative view of the world as compared to Solovyov and Bulgakov, who has a more harmonic vision in many ways. According to Berdyaev, the human beings are captured by the necessity of the material world. However, the power of thought enables our liberation, for Berdyaev. Philosophy as a creative act makes the human being a creator of the positive antidote to the world, that is, a creator of cosmos. But in both Bulgakov and in Berdyaev, they reinterpreted the classical idea of deification in a modern way as either labor or creativity. Now, finally, for Yevgeny Trubetskoy, as you all know, and as has been pointed out in several papers during this conference, he was a follower, but also a critic of Solovyov and his successors. Particularly pronounced was his rejection of what he saw as Solovyov, Bulgakov, and Berdyaev's Russian messianism, whose exaggerated belief in a Russian vocation he deemed too nationalist in its juxtaposition of Russia to the West. However, Trubetskoy too accepted that Russia possesses some vocation, as does every Christian nation, or at least every Christian region. Trubetskoy was an anti-utopian thinker, a critic, but this critique was nevertheless formulated within a Christian providentialist framework. And as we shall see, anti-utopianism did not mean a rejection of tasks for the future, even tasks of a world historical significance. But he also posed some certain limits to these tasks, or at least this is what he claimed to do. So I will concentrate on Trubetskoy's Meaning of Life, last work, Smysl Жизни, from 1918, which was a response to the experience of war. Is there a meaning of life, Trubetskoy asked. And the very term itself was loaded with profundity by Trubetskoy. Meaning, smysl, for Trubetskoy means the absolute significance, безусловное значение of something. Meaning in this sense is hence not subjective. It's the same for all, and is described by Trubetskoy in rather Platonic terms as unchangeable and unmovable. At the same time, Trubetskoy describes this meaning, thus conceived, repeatedly as an assumption, предположение. It's quite striking how often he uses this word in the introduction, in the opening of the work, предположение and предположить. And we also recognize this term from his previous work, published a year before, The Metaphysical Assumptions of Experience. Метафизические предположения. So meaning for Trubetskoy is transpsychological and even transcendental, but it's also something that we actively request. We search for meaning behind our personal impressions and ideas. We cannot but assume that there is such a meaning, because without it, it would be impossible for us to orient ourselves in the world simply. Trubetskoy defines meaning also as content, truth, or even meaning, truth, smysl istina, with a hyphen. Whatever definition, however, meaning, truth, and content cannot be separated from consciousness. Meaning, truth, as content is also thought. What exists is thought, or since thought is always about something, it's the content of consciousness. And this is where Trubetskoy's idealist position becomes evident, particularly evident. And it's closer to German idealism than to Plato, after all. By the same token, meaning, truth, is not only transcendent, but also immanent. It's not a mere copy of some transcendental world or ideas. Rather, to arrive at truth means to actively confirm a correct, truthful thought or idea. And I quote, "The search for the truth means the attempt to find the absolute consciousness in my consciousness, and my consciousness in the absolute," unquote. So since truth is thought on the one hand, and truth is not subjective on the other, Trubetskoy postulates also, and we saw this in the quote that I just read, he postulates also a level of absolute or all-encompassing consciousness or absolute thought. We are confident that our individual thought is part of an absolute consciousness, and the search for truth is a search for a correspondence with this absolute consciousness. Again, Trubetskoy repeatedly stresses that this is a metaphysical assumption, предположение. Quote, "Our thought lives by means of this assumption of absolute thought. To forsake it would have meant to forsake any thinking or consciousness, unquote. According to Trubetskoy, such forsaking of absolute thought is logically impossible, since it would simply imply a judgment that presupposes knowledge of absolute truth. Knowing the absolute along these ways, then, is described by Trubetskoy as a revelation in the broad meaning of the word, or a philosophical revelation. Our cognition and knowledge are therefore correlated with this assumed transcendental collective consciousness. Trubetskoy demonstrates this graphically in his text by emphasizing the prefix in Russian s or so, as in the Russian word for consciousness, as so-znание, so-znание. Co-knowledge, in slightly weird English perhaps, but also it emphasizes that this is shared knowledge. Yeah, Soviet also. He uses it with several words, also smysl. I think in general these prefixes and the way he emphasizes it are open to different interpretations. They are semantically very rich, and I've heard various compelling interpretations of them during this conference, but in particular with Saznania, I think this emphasis on the shared character is the main thing. So, for Trubetskoy, these terms underline the connection with something outside ourselves, the indebtedness of our mind to the absolute, or it being grounded there. Our colleague Igor Yevlampiev has pointed out that Trubetskoy insisted that the absolute has to be understood as thought. In contrast to Trubetskoy, who defined it as the suche, the existent of that which is, without specifying that it is thought. This enabled Trubetskoy also to include non-being in terms of that which is not yet in the absolute. This may also be an object for thought. So this is the idealist framework that Trubetskoy establishes for his philosophical quest for the meaning of life. It warrants that such a meaning exists, and that it exists in and as thought. Ultimate reality is the creation of the mind. Trubetskoy does not refer to God in the introduction. It's about meaning, thought, and consciousness. And yet, as you all know, this is a deeply Christian work, also for the fact that it contains far more biblical quotations than references to philosophers, but above all, of course, that it formulates an explicit Christian worldview, which is nevertheless grounded in a philosophical idealist framework. Having established this philosophical foundation on the basis of human intuition, Trubetskoy then proceeds to ideas or to meaningful content. What might the meaning of life be? And he considers different options, namely 3 different approaches to make life meaningful. First, the Indian one, as he calls it, that is the negative asceticism known from the Indian religions. Then there is the Greek positive vitalist option, vitalism of ancient Greece. And then finally, the third, the Christian worldview, the conquering of death, the transfiguration of mortal life. And Trubetskoy concludes, after considering these options, that life becomes truly meaningful through Christianity only. The meaning of life is found in the intersection between the joyous life of Greece and the ascetic practices of India. And this is precisely what Christianity, according to Trubetskoy, accomplishes. So it's not a rejection of the other ones, it's a synthesis that acknowledges the partial truth of the other options. Actually, Trubetskoy seems to be following Solovyov here. Solovyov, in Lectures on Divine Humanity, also saw Christianity as a dialectically, historically unfolding synthesis of Buddhism, the Greek worldview, Greek philosophy, and Judaism. There might also be a Hegelian background to this in this movement of reason from east to west. At least there's one dimension here, too. Also adopted from Solovyov is the concept of Syo, Elisye, Jedinstva, unity of all, which is also an assumption in Trubetskoy's work. This unity, the fullness of life on both an individual and a collective level, is presented as the goal towards which humanity should strive. We understand it as a duty, должное. The intuition of a meaning of life is, at the same time, precisely the intuition, a metaphysical assumption of a unity of all. And it is the Christian worldview that, according to Trubetskoy, allows us to discover this unity and therefore prompts us to strive for fullness. It's a reality, but it is also a project. The absolute idea is not only what exists, suche, it is also the divine intention about what should be, and intention that applies to humanity directly. Trubetskoy's providentialist understanding of history corresponds to this belief in the human contribution to all unity, or unity of all. Hence, the philosophical quest for the meaning of life is for Trubetskoy also a religious quest. And Christianity is understood by Trubetskoy, again, largely following Solovyov, as the religion of divine humanity, which bestows upon humanity the providentialist task of participating in God's creation, for which he uses the term tvorchestvo, rather than tvorение, conceptualized as a process of an extended creative act, tvorческий act. The human being participates in this plan as a mediator and a channel. According to Trubetskoy, God sees the human being as a friend, whereby he plays on the similarity in Russian between the words for other, drugoi, and friend, drug, so that the task becomes to develop from other to friend. And the relationship between the divine and human is or should be a friendship. And genuine friendship is possible since humanity is free also to reject it. So the human being is a free collaborator in a divinely conceived project. Another term that is part of the same rhetorical repertoire is co-participant, soúčastník. Not only účastník, but soúčastník. So again, we have this prefix so. So the human being is a co-participant in the creative act that aims at perfectibility, a creative act that stretches out in and is enabled by time and history. So this idea of divine human collaboration through creativity is also Trubetskoy's understanding of deification, aboženie, theosis. Deification means perfection of creation, involving the realization of God's image as the divine intention to be discovered and accepted as a task. In order to characterize this purpose of history, Trubetskoy too evokes the notion of Sophia, as did Bulgakov and Solovyov at length, but he also pays more attention to grace as a precondition for deification, which didn't play such a huge role in Solovyov and Bulgakov's early works. In Solovyov and Bulgakov's, in the lectures on godmanhood or divine wisdom, and in philosophy of economy, it's rather wisdom, divine wisdom, that connects humanity and God. But in Trubetskoy's view, Solovyov and Bulgakov went too far in seeing the fulfillment of creation as a task of humanity alone. Nevertheless, Trubetskoy sees deification as achieved both in the mind and in action, filled with creative energy. Towards the end of the work, Trubetskoy mentions culture, science, art, social activity as examples of how this might be achieved. In particular, action and creative action, tvorческое дело, means a serving, служение, of humanity, of the homeland, and of the closest human being. But at the same time, all this presupposes the ability, the activity of consciousness. The meaning of life is a work that puts very huge emphasis on the work of consciousness. The human being becomes a carrier of absolute thought by relating the absolute to the absolute through its cognitive acts. And I have a longer quote that I read. Human consciousness represents all unity in potentiality, and as far as it recognizes and acquires truth, it becomes all unity in reality. Thus is the image and likeness of that all unified consciousness, sjedinое сознание, accomplished in the human being, which carries within itself everything and is the truth about everything. This is the earthly likeness of the Almighty, unquote. Thus, for Trubetskoy, deification begins in consciousness and is fulfilled in action, but consciousness is a key premise. Another quote, the thought of Christ, and I emphasize thought here, mysl or Christie, who appeared in flesh, expresses for the Christian the main task of culture, that ground that it is called to incarnate in life, unquote. The divine intention is revealed for consciousness, becoming thereby also human knowledge, sa znanie. This depends on the human recognition of itself as a friend and an active participant in the creative act. The awareness and acceptance of this role and position then enables the human realization of the image of the Creator. Religion means to connect. Solovyov briefly made this point in the beginning of lectures on divine humanity. Trubetskoy makes it even more explicit. He reminds his reader that religion means to connect in the mind with the absolute and with other human beings. Trubetskoy proclaims that there is a parallel or a coincidence, savpayenie, between philosophical and natural revelation. That is, philosophical revelation or religious revelation, the revelation of the Bible. The parallel between the religious and the philosophical revelation. For Trubetskoy, logic reflects logos. The form of thought is the form of truth. There is an interesting contrast here to Badiaev. Badiaev was very negative of what he called discursive thought. Trubetskoy, by contrast, sees it in very positive terms as an expression of the absolute. Quote again, the calling of human thought is to be in line, is to live in the atmosphere of the eternal world that creates the world and in being the instrument for its revelation, unquote. So Christianity is for Trubetskoy a religion that confirms the significance of the logical form of thought. A Christian philosophy, which is what Trubetskoy himself engages in, is, quote again, the active participation of the human mind in the attaining knowledge of God, unquote. And as Solovyov, Trubetskoy too sees the contemplation of ideas as crucial for realizing them. Quote again, divine humanity is the discovery of the genuine idea entity for the entire humanity, unquote. The Trubetskoy's focus on consciousness is noteworthy in a work that is otherwise held to be informed by a Platonic setting. This was how Vasily Senkovsky, in his History of Russian Philosophy, described Trubetskoy's project in The Meaning of Life. Now, there is indeed a Platonic character to Trubetskoy's work. I mentioned it earlier, the absolute significance of meaning. Nevertheless, its idealism is first and foremost of a modern kind. And we should here keep in mind that the topic of the book is actually the meaning of life. It's not about the essence of life, though in many ways it's also about the essence of life, but first and foremost the meaning of life. So it's a question of perception, how to enable a meaningful perspective on life. And this is also what idealism offers, to attain a firm ground by means of our minds. So, my final remarks. The context of The Meaning of Life was catastrophic. And Trubetskoy, like so many other of his contemporaries, saw the catastrophic events around him as sign of the times, signifying an imminent end. And at first glance, this is a work that seems to confirm the prevailing apocalyptic mood of revolutionary Russia, which is well known and known from symbolism and a lot of other currents. And he seems to engage in this. However, there is also, in my view, an opposite tendency towards the end of his work, The Meaning of Life. The second coming, as he refers to it, will not take place until humanity has sufficiently prepared for it, in a positive sense. So it needs to reach the level of maturity. Sazrech is the Russian word he uses. On this basis, the seemingly apocalyptic situation in which this work was written, and itself even reinforces or contributes to, cannot be said to really signify the end of history. Rather, humanity was seemingly very far from attaining the divine likeness at the time of its writing. This made it all the more important for Trubetskoy to write The Meaning of Life, a work that called for a fundamental reorientation and a recognition of the crucial importance of logical thinking in order to accomplish ethical tasks. And it was therefore also a meta-philosophical work. Thank you.